At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law handed me a receipt and whispered, "We'll need you to cover your share," as if the man in that casket hadn't spent 42 years building a life with me. I remember the way the paper felt between my fingers, thin, ordinary, almost weightless, but somehow heavier than anything I had ever held. Around me, the chapel was filled with soft organ music and the low murmur of guests offering condolences, yet no one looked at me directly. Not really. They looked past me, through me, as though I were already fading into something irrelevant. Vanessa stood near the front, greeting people with composed elegance, dressed in black like the perfect grieving daughter-in-law, her voice warm and steady as she accepted their sympathy. Daniel stayed by her side, his hand resting gently at her back, a gesture I used to recognize as comfort, but now felt like allegiance. I sat in the second row, not the first where a wife belongs, but just far enough to suggest distance without explanation. No one corrected it. No one asked. I had chosen a simple black dress, one Robert always said made me look timeless, though now I wondered if it simply made me invisible. When the service began, the pastor spoke of Robert's generosity, his intelligence, the empire he had built from nothing. People nodded, impressed, respectful. But no one mentioned me. Not once. Not the woman who had stood beside him through every risk, every sleepless night, every decision that shaped the life they now admired. I kept my hands folded in my lap, still holding that receipt, smoothing its edges with my thumb as if it might change under pressure. Vanessa had leaned in just minutes earlier, her voice soft but firm, explaining that expenses had been significant and that it was only fair everyone contributed. Everyone. The word lingered in my mind, detached from meaning. I didn't ask questions. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, because something in her tone told me she had already decided who I was. And Daniel, he didn't look at me when she said it. Not once. During the eulogy, he spoke about his father's vision, his discipline, his legacy. His voice wavered at all the right moments, drawing quiet sympathy from the crowd. But when he mentioned family, he spoke only of what lay ahead, of carrying things forward, of building something new. I realized then that in his version of the future, I did not exist. A few rows behind me, I overheard a whisper, something about how difficult things must be for me now, how I'd probably need help, how Robert had handled everything. I almost smiled at that. Almost. Because they were right about one thing, Robert had handled everything. He had always believed in preparation, in control, in making sure nothing was left to chance. What they didn't understand, what none of them had bothered to consider, was that he had trusted me enough to make sure I was never left with nothing. I sat there through the rest of the service, listening, observing, letting them build their quiet assumptions around me like a fragile house of cards. No one asked me about money. No one wondered. And I never said a word. I did not go home right away after the service ended. I stayed seated long after most of the guests had filed out, listening to the fading echo of footsteps against the polished floor, watching as the rows of chairs slowly emptied until only a few distant figures remained. The air felt different once the room was nearly empty, quieter in a way that revealed things more clearly. I noticed how quickly Vanessa shifted once the audience disappeared, her composed smile dissolving into something sharper, more efficient. She began directing the staff, discussing arrangements, speaking about timing and logistics as if this were just another event to manage. Daniel followed her, nodding along, occasionally adding a comment, but never once turning toward me. It was as if the role I had played in his life had already been rewritten without my consent. I stood up eventually, smoothing my dress, placing the folded receipt carefully into my purse. Not because I intended to pay it, but because I wanted to remember it. Every word. Every assumption. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the parking lot, pale and distant, the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it really is. People gathered in small clusters, exchanging final condolences, their voices low and polite. A few approached me, offering brief hugs, their words kind but distant, like lines they had practiced before arriving. I thanked them all with the same measured tone, the same calm expression. No one lingered. No one asked what I would do next. I realized then that they had already decided that for me too. As I walked toward my car, I overheard Vanessa speaking just a few feet away, her voice no longer softened by performance. She was discussing the house. Not in a sentimental way, not in a way that acknowledged what it had been, but in terms of square footage, location, potential value. She mentioned renovations, resale possibilities, timelines. Daniel responded with quiet agreement, asking practical questions as though the transition had already begun. I paused for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the car door, and listened. Not because I was surprised, but because I wanted to hear how easily they could erase something that had taken me a lifetime to build. There was no hesitation in their voices, no trace of doubt. To them, this was simply the next step. I opened the door and sat inside, closing it gently, shutting out their voices, but not the understanding that came with them. The interior of the car still smelled faintly like Robert's cologne, a subtle trace that had not yet faded. I placed my hands on the steering wheel and sat there for a long moment, not moving, not rushing. I thought about the years behind me, the choices we had made, the quiet conversations late at night when Robert would speak about the future in a way that always felt deliberate. He had never been careless. Not with his work, not with his plans, and certainly not with me. That was something I understood more clearly now than ever before. I started the engine, the soft hum breaking the stillness, and pulled out of the parking lot without looking back. They believed I was stepping into uncertainty, into dependence, into a life shaped by their decisions. And I let them believe it. For now, that was exactly where I needed them to be. The house felt larger than it ever had that evening, not because anything had changed, but because everything had been quietly taken away from it. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing through rooms that still carried the shape of a life that no longer existed in the way it once had. The air was still, untouched, as though time had paused here while the rest of the world moved on without asking permission. I sat, my purse down on the entry table, my fingers lingering for a moment on the leather, feeling the outline of the folded receipt inside. It remained exactly where I had placed it, unchanged, like everything else they believed about me. I walked slowly through the living room, past the armchair where Robert used to sit every evening, the indentation in the cushion still faintly visible, as if he might return at any moment and ask about dinner or the news. I did not turn on the lights right away. I let the dim glow from the windows stretch across the floor, tracing familiar patterns that had once brought comfort and now revealed distance. On the mantel, the photographs remained untouched, frozen in moments where everything looked whole, where Daniel still stood close to me without hesitation, where Vanessa's smile had not yet learned how to measure value. I paused there, studying one photo in particular, taken years ago during a summer afternoon in the backyard. Robert had his arm around me, his expression relaxed, confident in a way that came from knowing exactly what he had built and who he had built it with. He had always been certain about the future, certain enough to plan for things others never considered. I moved into the kitchen, placing my keys on the counter with a soft, deliberate motion. The silence followed me, not heavy, not suffocating, but clear. It allowed every thought to settle into place without interruption. I opened a drawer and took out a small envelope, one I had not touched in months, though I had always known exactly where it was. Inside were documents Robert had insisted I keep separate, organized, secure. At the time, he had explained everything in careful detail, his tone calm, almost routine, as though he were discussing something ordinary rather than something that would one day matter more than anything else. I had listened, asked questions, understood. And then I had put it away, not because I doubted him, but because I trusted that I would only need it when the time was right. I closed the drawer again, leaving the envelope exactly where it belonged. Not yet. There was no urgency. Not for me. Upstairs, the bedroom remained just as I had left it that morning, the bed neatly made, his side undisturbed. I sat down at the edge, resting my hands in my lap, and allowed the quiet to settle once more. They believed this house would soon belong to them. They believed decisions had already been made, that outcomes were already certain. I thought about Vanessa's voice in the parking lot, about the confidence in her tone, the ease with which she spoke about things that were not hers. I thought about Daniel, about the way he had avoided my eyes, about how quickly he had accepted a version of reality that required no questions. And I understood something then, something simple and steady. They were not waiting for permission. They were waiting for confirmation. And I had given them neither. I lay back slowly, staring up at the ceiling, remembering the quiet conversations Robert and I used to have in this very room, the ones where he would speak not about what was obvious, but about what was hidden beneath it. He had always believed that people reveal themselves most clearly when they think no one is paying attention. I closed my eyes, not in exhaustion, but in certainty. Because now, more than ever, I was paying attention. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet that does not announce itself, but simply settles into every corner of the house as if it has always belonged there. I woke before the sun had fully risen, not because I had slept well, but because there was nothing left to hold me in place. For decades, my mornings had followed a rhythm shaped by shared routines, small conversations, the familiar presence of another person moving through the same space. Now, there was only stillness. I moved through it slowly, deliberately, making coffee the same way I always had, measuring each scoop with the same care, pouring water with the same steady hand. The machine hummed softly, filling the silence just enough to make it feel intentional rather than empty. I carried the cup to the kitchen table and sat down, looking out at the backyard where the early light stretched across the grass in long, pale lines. Everything looked exactly as it always had, and yet nothing felt the same. I took a sip and let the warmth settle, grounding myself in something simple, something unchanged. A few minutes later, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the quiet. I did not need to look to know who it was. The timing was too precise, too convenient to be anything else. I set my cup down gently and remained seated, waiting. The front door opened without hesitation, followed by the familiar sound of footsteps that did not pause to ask permission. Vanessa entered first, her expression composed, purposeful, as though she had already mapped out the conversation before stepping inside. Daniel followed closely behind her, his movements quieter, less certain, but still aligned with hers in a way that left no room for interpretation. "We thought it would be best to come by early," Vanessa said, her voice smooth, controlled, carrying a tone that suggested this was not a discussion, but a continuation of something already decided. I nodded once, not inviting them to sit, not offering anything beyond acknowledgement. She continued without waiting. She spoke about responsibilities, about practical matters that needed to be addressed quickly, about how overwhelming it would be for me to manage everything alone. Her words were carefully chosen, wrapped in concern, but each one carried the same underlying message. "You cannot handle this. You should not try." Daniel added a few quiet agreements, his eyes briefly meeting mine before drifting away again, as if holding my gaze required more than he was willing to give. Then Vanessa reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table in front of me. It was neat, organized, labeled with tabs that suggested preparation and intent. "We have already started looking into options," she said. "This would make things easier for everyone." I looked at the folder but did not open it. I did not need to. I already knew what it contained. Plans. Transfers. Arrangements that assumed my compliance before I had even been asked. I rested my hand lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, and allowed a small silence to form between us. It was not uncomfortable. Not for me. Vanessa filled it quickly, explaining timelines, mentioning figures, speaking about the house again, about how it could be better utilized. Better. The word lingered in the air, detached from meaning. I finally lifted my eyes to meet hers, holding her gaze just long enough to register the confidence there, the certainty that she understood the situation completely. Then I looked at Daniel, giving him the same quiet attention, the same opportunity to say something different. He did not. I nodded once more, slow and measured, then slid the folder slightly to the side without opening it. "I will think about it," I said, my voice calm, even, offering nothing more. Vanessa smiled, satisfied, interpreting my response exactly as she expected to. Daniel exhaled softly, as if something had been resolved. They stood a moment later, their visit complete, their purpose fulfilled. As the door closed behind them, the house returned to silence, but it was no longer the same silence as before. This one was clearer, sharper, filled with understanding. I picked up my coffee again, now lukewarm, and took another sip. They believed they had taken the first step. They believed I had already begun to follow. And I let them believe it. I did not open the folder that day, and I did not open it the next. Instead, I left it exactly where Vanessa had placed it, resting on the corner of the table like a quiet assumption waiting to be confirmed. Each time I passed by, I noticed it without touching it, allowing its presence to settle into the rhythm of the house the same way everything else had. There was no urgency in me, no pressure to respond, because I understood something they did not. Time, in this situation, was not working against me. It was revealing them. On the third morning, I woke to a message from Daniel, short and carefully worded, asking if I had reviewed the documents and whether I needed help understanding anything. I read it once, then set my phone down without replying. Not because I did not understand, but because I understood perfectly. A few hours later, another message arrived, this time from Vanessa, her tone warmer, more polished, offering to stop by again, to walk me through everything step by step. I could almost hear the patience in her voice, the practiced kindness that assumed I required guidance. I placed the phone face down on the counter and continued with my morning, pouring coffee, opening the curtains, letting the light move slowly across the floor. They were waiting for movement from me, for some sign that I was ready to follow the path they had outlined. Instead, I remained still. That afternoon, I decided to take a drive, not to go anywhere specific, but to create space between their expectations and my reality. The roads were familiar, lined with places that had once held meaning in ways that felt distant now. I passed the office building where Robert had spent so many years, the small diner where we used to meet on Fridays, the bank where he insisted on handling certain matters in person, even when it would have been easier not to. I slowed as I approached it, remembering the quiet confidence in his voice whenever he spoke about preparation, about making sure that nothing important was ever left to assumption. I parked across the street and sat there for a moment, watching people come and go, each one moving with purpose, unaware of how easily plans can be misunderstood by those who were never meant to see them. When I returned home, the house greeted me with the same calm stillness, unchanged, waiting. The folder remained where it had been, untouched, its edges perfectly aligned as if it had never been disturbed. I walked past it once, then again, before finally stopping. Not to open it, but to move it. I picked it up carefully and placed it in a drawer, closing it with a soft, deliberate motion. Out of sight, but not forgotten. That evening, Daniel called. His voice carried a hint of impatience beneath its softness, asking again if I had made any decisions, if I needed assistance, if I was feeling overwhelmed. I listened without interrupting, letting him fill the silence the way Vanessa always did. When he finished, I responded simply, telling him that I was taking my time, that there was no need to rush. He paused, just long enough for me to hear the shift in his breathing, the subtle discomfort of something not going according to expectation. Of course, he said finally, though his tone suggested otherwise. After the call ended, I set the phone aside and sat quietly, allowing the silence to settle once more. They believed hesitation meant weakness. They believed delay meant confusion. They believed that if they applied enough pressure, I would eventually give in. But what they did not understand was that I was not hesitating. I was observing. And the more they spoke, the clearer everything became. 2 days later, I received a call I had been expecting, though not in the way they might have imagined. The number was familiar, one I had not seen on my screen in quite some time, but one that carried a quiet weight behind it. I answered on the second ring, my voice steady, my tone neutral, as though nothing in my world had shifted. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm, measured, carrying the same professionalism I had always associated with him. "I wanted to check in and see how you were holding up." I stepped into the living room as he spoke, moving slowly, my eyes drifting briefly to the mantel before settling on the window beyond it. I am doing exactly as well as expected, I replied, neither inviting sympathy nor rejecting it. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that suggested understanding rather than uncertainty. I assume you have heard from them, he continued, his choice of words precise, deliberate. I allowed a small silence before answering. Yes, I said simply. That was enough. He did not need more explanation. And, he asked, not pressing, but opening a space for clarity. I sat down in the same chair I had passed so many times over the last few days, resting my hands lightly on my lap. They have plans, I said. Another pause followed, slightly longer this time, and then a quiet exhale that sounded almost like acknowledgement. I thought they might, he replied. His voice carried no surprise, only confirmation. They do not know, do they? He added, lowering his tone just enough to make the question feel less like curiosity and more like certainty. I let the question settle between us for a moment, not because I needed time to answer, but because I wanted to feel the full weight of it. No, I said finally. They do not. There was something in the silence that followed that felt different from all the others I had experienced in recent days. This one was not filled with assumption or expectation. It was grounded, steady, built on shared understanding. Good, he said after a moment. Then there is no reason to rush anything. I leaned back slightly, letting his words align with my own thoughts, not as instruction, but as confirmation. There never was, I replied. He gave a small, almost imperceptible chuckle, the kind that carried more meaning than sound. Robert was very clear about that, he said. Hearing his name spoken in that context did not bring sadness in the way it might have before. Instead, it brought clarity, structure, intention. He always was, I answered. We spoke for a few minutes longer, not about details, not about numbers or documents, but about timing, about patience, about allowing things to unfold exactly as they were meant to. Before ending the call, he paused once more. When you are ready, he said, everything is already in place. I thanked him, not formally, not out of obligation, but with a quiet certainty that required no elaboration. When the call ended, I set my phone down and remained seated for a moment, letting the stillness settle again, though it no longer felt empty. It felt intentional. Later that afternoon, another message came from Vanessa, this one more direct than the others, asking if I had made any progress, if I had considered the options, if I needed assistance moving forward. I read it once, then again, noticing the shift in tone, the subtle impatience beneath the polished words. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the yard that had once been filled with movement, with laughter, with a sense of continuity that now existed only in memory. They were waiting for me to make a decision that would confirm their version of events. They were waiting for me to step into the role they had already written. I picked up my phone, typed a short response, and paused for just a moment before sending it. I am taking care of things, I wrote. Nothing more. Nothing less. It was enough to keep them confident. Enough to keep them moving forward exactly as they intended. And exactly as I needed them to. By the end of the week, their confidence had grown quieter but stronger, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud because it assumes it is already understood. Vanessa stopped asking if I needed help and began informing me of what would happen next. Messages shifted from suggestions to statements, from polite offers to carefully worded updates that left little room for interpretation. She mentioned appointments with real estate agents, preliminary discussions about valuation, even potential timelines for listing. Each message was composed with the same measured tone, the same illusion of inclusion, as if I were part of a process that had already moved beyond me. Daniel followed her lead, his calls less frequent but more pointed, asking if I had gathered my personal belongings, if I had considered where I might stay once the house was no longer practical. Practical. That word again, used as a substitute for something they did not want to say directly. I responded the same way each time, calm, brief, non-committal, offering just enough to keep them moving forward without ever confirming anything they needed. One afternoon, they arrived unannounced, not with hesitation, but with purpose. Vanessa carried a folder similar to the first, though thicker, more detailed, while Daniel walked a step behind her, his expression composed but distant. They moved through the house with a quiet familiarity that no longer asked permission, pausing occasionally to discuss features, making small observations about space and layout as though they were already seeing it through someone else's eyes. I followed at a distance, not intervening, not correcting, simply observing the way they spoke about each room, each object, each memory as if it were already detached from me. In the living room, Vanessa gestured toward the windows, commenting on natural light and resale appeal. In the kitchen, she noted the need for updates, suggesting minor renovations that could increase value. Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding a detail, his voice low, his tone practical, as if he had already accepted that this was the direction things would take. They stopped in the doorway of the bedroom, the one I had not changed since that morning, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. It was the only pause that felt unplanned, the only space where something unscripted might have surfaced. But it passed quickly. Vanessa stepped back, clearing her throat softly, returning to the same steady rhythm she had maintained from the beginning. "It will all make sense soon," she said, her voice gentle, reassuring, as if she were offering comfort rather than control. I nodded once, meeting her gaze just long enough to acknowledge the statement without agreeing to it. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, for the first time in days, his expression searching for something he could not quite define. I held his gaze calmly, giving him nothing to confirm and nothing to challenge. After a moment, he looked away. When they left, the house felt different again, not because anything had been taken, but because something had been revealed. Their certainty was no longer hidden behind politeness or suggestion. It had become visible, structured, almost complete. I walked through each room after they were gone, not to reclaim it, not to hold on to anything, but to understand the way they had already begun to let it go. In the kitchen, I ran my hand lightly across the counter, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips. In the living room, I paused by the window, watching the late afternoon light shift slowly across the floor. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had been decided. Or at least, that was what they believed. I returned to the table and sat down, folding my hands neatly in front of me, allowing the silence to settle once more. They were preparing for an outcome they thought was inevitable. They were building momentum, moving forward with quiet confidence, certain that nothing would interrupt the path they had chosen. And I let them continue. Because the more certain they became, the less they questioned anything at all. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, a detail Vanessa delivered with quiet satisfaction, as though the date itself marked the beginning of something inevitable. She framed it as a necessary step, a simple formality to ensure everything was handled properly, but the precision in her voice suggested something more deliberate. I agreed without hesitation, my tone even, my expression unchanged, giving her exactly what she expected and nothing more. The days leading up to it passed with a calm that felt almost unnatural, the house settling into a rhythm that no longer belonged to the life it once held. I moved through each room as I always had, preparing meals I did not need, straightening things that were already in place, maintaining a sense of order that no longer served a practical purpose, but carried its own quiet significance. Each action was deliberate, each moment measured, not out of routine, but out of awareness. They continued their preparations with increasing confidence, their messages shifting from updates to confirmations, their language filled with assumptions that no longer needed to be disguised. Vanessa spoke of timelines as though they had already been agreed upon, mentioning potential buyers, discussing market conditions, referencing conversations I had never been part of. Daniel followed her lead, his voice steady, his questions focused not on possibility, but on execution. They had moved beyond uncertainty. They had moved into expectation. The morning of the meeting arrived with a clear sky and a stillness that felt almost intentional, as if even the world outside understood the weight of what was about to unfold. I dressed carefully, choosing something simple, understated, nothing that would draw attention or invite interpretation. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw exactly what they saw. A woman who had stepped back. A woman who had accepted what was coming. I let that image remain unchanged. The office was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that carries professionalism rather than absence, where every detail is controlled and every movement has purpose. Vanessa and Daniel were already there, seated side by side, their posture composed, their expressions calm, though I could see the anticipation beneath it. Vanessa greeted me with a measured smile, one that suggested reassurance, but revealed expectation. Daniel nodded, his eyes briefly meeting mine before settling elsewhere, as though he was already preparing for the outcome he believed was certain. I took my seat across from them, placing my hands gently on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in something steady. The lawyer entered moments later, his presence quiet but deliberate, carrying a folder that remained closed as he took his seat. There was no rush in his movements, no sense of urgency, only a calm precision that contrasted sharply with the tension that had begun to form around the table. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her voice controlled but eager, asking if everything was ready to proceed. He nodded once, acknowledging her without confirming anything beyond the moment itself. Daniel exhaled softly, a small release of tension that suggested relief more than anything else. They believed this was the final step, the moment where everything they had assumed would be confirmed, where plans would become reality, where certainty would replace speculation. I remained still, my expression unchanged, my posture relaxed, allowing the silence to settle just long enough to stretch their anticipation further. Vanessa glanced at me briefly, as if expecting some reaction, some sign that I understood what was about to happen. I gave her none. The lawyer finally opened the folder, his movements unhurried, precise, revealing documents that had been prepared long before any of them had begun to make their plans. And in that moment, as their attention fixed on the pages before them, I understood exactly how complete their confidence had become. They were not waiting to see what would happen. They were waiting to hear what they already believed to be true. And I let them wait. The lawyer adjusted the papers in front of him with a quiet precision that seemed almost deliberate, as though he understood the weight of each second that passed before he spoke. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her hands resting neatly on the table, her posture composed but alert, ready to receive what she had already decided was hers. Daniel sat beside her, his shoulders squared, his expression controlled, though there was a subtle tension in the way his fingers tapped once against the edge of the table before going still. I remained exactly where I was, my hands folded calmly, my gaze steady, offering no reaction, no anticipation, nothing that would disturb the version of events they had constructed so carefully. The lawyer began in a measured tone, outlining formalities, referencing documents, establishing context with a clarity that left no room for interruption. Vanessa nodded occasionally, her expression softening into what looked like relief, as though each word confirmed what she had been expecting to hear. Daniel exhaled quietly, his posture easing, his attention fixed on the pages, as if the outcome had already been secured. Then the lawyer paused, just briefly, before continuing in a tone that did not change, but shifted in meaning. He spoke of structure, of decisions made well in advance, of provisions designed not for convenience, but for certainty. Vanessa's expression remained composed at first, though I noticed the slight hesitation in her eyes, the momentary flicker of confusion that she quickly tried to smooth over. Daniel leaned forward, his brow tightening just enough to suggest something was no longer aligning with what he had assumed. The lawyer continued without pause, his voice steady, his delivery precise, explaining that the entirety of Robert's estate, every account, every asset, every interest, had been placed into a trust long before any of them had begun discussing what would happen next. A trust that had been structured with clear authority, clear control, and very specific conditions. Vanessa's posture shifted then, not dramatically, but enough to break the illusion of certainty she had carried into the room. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked, her voice still controlled, though the smoothness had begun to thin. The lawyer turned a page, his expression unchanged, and answered simply, directly, without emphasis. It meant that full control of everything Robert had built had been transferred entirely and exclusively to me. Not partially. Not conditionally. Completely. The room fell into a silence that felt different from all the others that had come before it. This one was not filled with assumption or expectation. It was filled with realization. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, his expression searching, unsettled, as if trying to reconcile the person he thought I was with the reality now sitting in front of him. Vanessa remained still, though I could see the calculation in her eyes shifting rapidly, trying to find a path that no longer existed. The lawyer continued, outlining the remaining terms with the same calm precision, explaining that any actions taken under false assumptions, any attempts to influence or pressure, had no legal standing, no authority, no consequence beyond revealing intent. I listened without interrupting, without reacting, allowing each word to settle exactly where it needed to. When he finished, the silence returned once more, but this time it belonged to me. I placed my hands gently on the table, meeting Vanessa's gaze first, then Daniel's, holding each of them just long enough to make one thing unmistakably clear. I had never misunderstood anything. I had never been uncertain. I had simply allowed them to believe that I was. You should have asked, I said quietly, my voice calm, steady, carrying no anger, no bitterness, only clarity. Neither of them responded. There was nothing left for them to say. I stood up slowly, smoothing my sleeve, my movements unhurried, and turned toward the door. I did not look back. I did not need to, because everything they had built in silence had already come undone the moment the truth was spoken. And I had known, from the very beginning, exactly how this would end.